Welcome to Season 4 of Under the Sisterhood, Women's March for Mental Wellness. This season, we're diving deep into the intersection of women's mental health and overall wellness, bringing you thought-provoking conversations every Friday. We'll explore a wide range of topics, including how mental health impacts every stage of a woman's life, the intricate connections between physical and emotional well-being, and the role of practitioners who champion mental wellness. This podcast celebrates women, their resilience, and the incredible contributions they make to our world. I'm Elizabeth Elfenbein. Let's get under the hood. Today we're getting under the hood with Lucy Coplin, a daughter, sister, friend, women's advocate, and a licensed master social worker working as a therapist in New York City. Throughout Lucy's career, she has specialized in working with a wide variety of clients, including children and families, but she has often worked with young people identifying as LGBT+ and or neurodivergent, also had the opportunity to train other providers on both subjects. Lucy provides a strength-based approach to therapy that employs a mixture of DBT, mindfulness, and other styles as needed so as to best center each client. She received her bachelor's in psychology from Kenyon College and her master of social work from Fordham University. When Lucy is not working in the field, she is doing pilates, acting, or resting on the couch with her two cats, Calvin and Oliver. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
I'm really excited. As I said, it's Women's March for Mental Wellness, and it's an incredibly important season and an important topic, and I'm so delighted to be getting under the hood with you. If it's okay, can we get going?
Of course we can. Let's go.
Awesome. So, Lucy, I'm really curious, as we look, and I just read your introduction, at what point, what was that inflection point that got you interested in the mental health and wellness space?
So I think it was a bit of an evolution of an inflection. The first spark, I feel like, was kind of lit, for lack of a better word, when I was in high school and my mother was in graduate school for social work. And she would sometimes talk with me about her clients. We're very close. We talk a lot. She would talk to me, not about her clients, about her textbooks and such. And I'm like, that's really interesting. I really feel like I can get into this. But at the time, I still was kind of focused on being an actor or maybe like an English major. So when I went into college, that was kind of my projected goal. I was maybe going to be an acting major or an English major. And it was a difficult time for everyone, freshman year of college and moving in. I had a lot of friends. All of us at one point or the other had struggles we went through, and we'd all communicate about it and share experiences, especially with, getting counseling potentially from the counseling centers of various schools, not just mine. And, honestly, it was a lot of experiences were not so great, not just with counseling, just in general, like that growing up, that growing into yourself and everything. It was a tough time. And that was the point for me where I kind of put it all together. And I was like, I want to be the person that me and my friends really need right now, if that makes sense. I really want to be there and provide that support because I know that we all need it so badly right now. So that was kind of the moment where I really decided that I wanted to work with young people and I really wanted to be a therapist.
What was the experience like? So as you got in and you made that decision, what was the journey like from there on?
Well, luckily, I was at the perfect point to pick my major, so it was very advantageous that way. So I transitioned into taking more I already was kind of interested in psychology, partly because of my mother. I was taking some courses, but I basically zeroed in on psychology because my school did not have any other kind of therapy. There was no social work major at that school. So I took some really wonderful psychology classes, learned a lot, really got a sense of what parts of psychology I was interested in. And then I eventually evolved into social work because my other passion in college honestly ended up being sociology. And I always like to say that social work is as if psychology and sociology had a baby. Psychology is very much oriented on the introspective, what's going on in your brain right now. Not always, but as a general rule. And sociology is about how do systems affect a person. Doesn't really matter as much what's going on in your head. It really matters how does culture, how does the macro affect you? And I was like, I think both actually affect you very much. And that's kind of what social work is. It's looking at both the inner workings as well as the social goings on of the time.
What did you find? What were you passionate about in the psychology world? And then talk about your sociology experience, because I think I love the reference to, bringing them together is like having a baby.
I think I was honestly very intrigued, especially by the criticisms of psychology. Like, I took a cross-cultural psychology class with a wonderful professor who had like a big hand in steering my success in college. And it was all about how a lot of experiments and a lot of like the things we take for granted when it comes to psychology are very focused on the one population in particular, which, honestly is white, straight, cis, male, college educated, actually, as well. A lot of the experiments that we take for granted, like the Stanford prison experiment, are all based on that population. And of course, we live in a very diverse world, even just in our country, but especially across the world. And a lot of populations are going unstudied and therefore undercared for. So the cross-cultural piece of it, the cultural humility, the cultural competence, really I latched onto, and that kind of opened my brain to, especially, LGBT, neurodivergent, etc. So that was really something I oriented on. And other than that, in psychology, I really enjoyed the developmental models, talking about like, what stages of life you're in, how those stages of life affect who you become. Two primary topics I was really focused on.
You've seen a lot in this journey now. I mean, you're still very young in your career, but you've seen a lot. So seeing that and seeing the underrepresented, what has that sort of driven you to do? Or, has that made you more of an activist as you're pursuing this? Like, how has that really impacted you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it's a blessing and opening your eyes to that sort of injustice is a blessing and a curse because it means you can help people, but it also honestly, it's hard to come to terms with. It's really one of those things where once you start realizing it, you can't stop, and then anything anyone says, you really tend to overanalyze. But I think that a lot of my work, especially working in the city, has been a lot with minorities, a lot of different types of minorities, a lot of different underrepresented populations, and I think that I've really led, or I at least have attempted to lead with that cultural humility in terms of, especially, I'm a white therapist, and that's, something to really keep track of and keep tabs on because a white therapist can honestly do a lot of harm. And so I really think that my background has kind of helped me steer myself in my career in a way where I'm really trying to, in my intro, you mentioned client centered. It's really all about the client, and I have to leave my own insecurities, but also my own biases at the door.
I want to circle back to the cultural humility. I think your generation seeing things, the cultural humility that exists today that never existed before is just amazing. And, I think a lot about the level of consciousness in every aspect of life. So I think it's really good. I think it's interesting that you say that, as you just referred to, like the cultural humility, but leading into, where you are today and how you have to leave your biases at the door. Do you find that to be hard, Lucy?
I think that if I were to say no, it's not hard, I think that would be not very culturally humble of me. I think that it is a lifelong practice that you really have to throw yourself into because I'm never going to, I work with a lot of clients that are very different backgrounds from me, and I never want to say, I totally get you. I totally know what you're going through. I understand it completely. Been there, even, you know what I mean? I always want to be not nervous about it, but I always want to be cognizant of it, and I always want to focus on it as something to work through. So I think that it's a kind of necessary lifelong struggle in a way. Although I don't, I'm at peace with it, but yeah.
That's a lot to hold on to all the other things you need to know. And then you have to balance that cultural sensitivity in a space and
Right.
really understand it and read the space, like really understand how to do that. I think that's really interesting. So you made a comment. I know that you do work with the LGBT plus community as well as neurodivergent. Talk a little bit about how all of this came about, and it would be great if you can link it to as you progressed along into your master's in social work and coming out of that.
I myself am part of the LGBT community. I identify as part of the community, and a lot of my friends did and do as well. So that was always something that I was cognizant about. And a lot of my friends and myself, experienced some situations where we're like, wow, this is tough. It's tough to not only be in this difficult time of life, but also to be a member of this group. I could get into a lot more about this, but I'm going to keep it succinct. A lot of therapists are not very great at reaching out sometimes to these different populations if they haven't really actively tried to research and study and understand what it's like to treat clients like that. So that was definitely something I saw. I just feel like as I got into my master's, I ended up having field placements, which is like, an internship you have when you're in graduate school for social workers. A lot of the clients just happened to be neurodivergent. It just happened to work out that way, just basically where I was placed. So that was the other piece of it. I learned a lot about that, especially during that time. I also had friends who, have experienced neurodivergence, et cetera. And it was just kind of like the LGBT population. There's a lot of harm a therapist can do without really understanding why someone is who they are, what they experience because of that. And I was just like, well, I don't want to be a bad therapist. So I want to be able to really immerse myself in this. And I have a real passion for not only learning about it myself, but also talking to other people about it and giving these trainings that I've been giving as well. So I think that's kind of how it started to build and build. The more I got into it, the more I was enthused about it and the more I wanted to help people like that.
Probably therapists who've been therapists for longer periods of time have certain biases, because they've been doing it, they've been seeing and witnessing it. And so I think, seeing things differently and experiencing them differently in different generations make for a different approach, if you were a different model. So how are you? So you're doing these trainings, you're doing this work within these communities. What are you seeing and how are you dealing with it?
I'm seeing a lot of anxiety and depression, especially, when it comes to kind of accepting the way life is and experiencing the difficulties that these communities can experience. It does go, unfortunately, growing up as a young person as an LGBT person, as a neurodivergent person. When you get to the age that I work with, especially where you're old enough to understand the injustices that can occur, that's a terrible thing to be faced with. It's an extra burden that really you have to have as a young person. And there's a lot of trauma, honestly, in these communities, especially with people like me from my field, but hospitals, doctors, any interaction. Like, for example, an autistic person with sensory issues, the dentist is a nightmare for, and that's like that can be a lifelong trauma. And then for someone who's LGBT who has a therapist who's like, are you sure that you're really, what I mean? All these little encounters. Oh yeah, I mean, these things happen. There's a lot of trauma to unpack, and trauma is a whole nother topic and it can be a very vicious cycle of being re-traumatized in the system. So a trauma-focused lens is also very important, I feel like, in this field as well. Did I answer your question? I feel like I went off a little bit.
No, I think you did great, because there's no perfect answers. And I think that the work you're doing is really amazing. I think it's really helpful for you to talk a little more. I mean, I don't want you to talk about anxiety, depression per se, but like talk about culturally what's going on in these marginalized communities, these communities that are different. They're neurodivergent. They are different than the norm and really special. Like, what is going on? And from a mental health and wellness perspective, what can people do and help and be helpful with?
I think that there's a lot of isolation in these communities. I think that in New York City, we're a little more fortunate than a lot of other communities, honestly, when it comes to representation and the aspect of community. I mean, we all know that there's a lot of, LGBT communities in the city, but still there's a lot of isolation. I think social media also doesn't help there as well. It can help or it can hurt, but sometimes it hurts. But especially, thinking about rural communities or communities that just don't have a lot of variation in the country, in the world, there's a lot of isolation, and that's a real silent killer of, like, honestly, it is very difficult to. I mean, being a young person, you're already so focused on who am I, how do I fit in, and then you have that extra burden. It's very tough. I think that then that kind of leads to my second part of the answer, which is really finding community and acceptance is so crucial. And as a mental health and wellness thing, I mean, I think that's like the biggest aspect of it. It's having your people who say, I know who you are, I accept you, that unconditional positive regard, which is just being like, whoever you are as a person, whatever you do, I always will care for you. If you can't have that, unfortunately, not everyone has that with their parents. A lot of LGBT youth do not. Finding that with a trusted adult or some friends or things like that. Finding your people, but also at least just being able to accept differences in people, even if you don't completely understand them. That's a big thing I would talk to a lot of parents about. If they would say, I don't really get it. I don't get why they're like this. I'd be like, the good news is you don't have to. You just have to love them anyway.
As a parent of someone in the LGBT plus community, I just can't imagine not getting it. I also come from the creative field.
Mm-hmm.
People are people. I love people. I love what makes them unique and different and special. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really hard to fathom that people don't. But we live in a very ignorant world. And I
Mm-hmm.
want to talk a little bit, and not a little bit, I'm very curious to talk about the systems that you mentioned, because you talked about sociology. And so you talked about social humility, but you talked about the systems that we live in. And I think it would be interesting to share that in combination with what you're seeing as it regards to the LGBT plus, as well as neurodivergent communities.
I mean, a lot of it is public policies, to be honest. It's a bit of a lot to get into because it can be a little grim, right? A lot of it is who gets health insurance, to be honest, is a big part of it. Is very simply it's everything. A lot of therapists don't, a lot of, especially psychiatrists and psychologists don't even take a lot of insurance. So like Medicaid is often completely off the table. And I've seen, clients with Medicaid wait so long just to be able to receive care. And that's a huge part of it too. It's just basically who can afford to, who gets the insurance, who gets seen. But it's also a bit of, are these systems, are these places that are treating these people, how culturally competent, how culturally humble are they? And how prepared are they to not accidentally turn away a client by accidentally alienating them for whatever reason. And it's also just about access to treatment. Where you are geographically is a huge thing as well. That's a huge part of it. And just also how does everyone else feel about you based on current cultural and political influences? And, there's a certain sense of impending doom for a lot of young people
Mhm.
right now, honestly, which is, very hard to work with because, the reality is that things are, can get very scary. And there's not a lot that I, as an individual, can do that when working with a client. I can't, wave a magic wand and poof that away. I'm also kind of bummed about it, believe it or not. So, yeah, I think the biggest thing is political, but also in terms of cultural, it's just the choices that agencies make and how they treat their clients.
It must be challenging to go into those spaces when you are feeling it and you have to put on the face of a leader and listen. What is that like for you? How do you deal and cope with that every day, Lucy?
It's one of the most important parts of the job. A lot of personality tests will say like, or career aptitude tests will be like, oh, you're a social worker, you're a bleeding heart. You're all full of love. And I'm like, honestly, yes, in a way, but as a social worker for success or as a therapist, you need to have strong boundaries and you need to be able to put one hat on and then take that hat off. And that's been something that I've was constantly a learning process for me, especially at the beginning, and sometimes still is. I think that there's a certain element that you can certain amounts you can give away of yourself if the situation is apt. Like if a client says something that is sad, especially something that like about like, oh, I politically or whatever, it's okay. I believe, and a lot of therapists do believe this as well. It's okay to say it is scary. I agree with you. You know what I mean? Because clients don't necessarily want, a lot of clients, I shouldn't say all, a lot of clients don't want a Freudian, like, and how does that make you feel, like blank faced person to talk to. They want a human being who is going to be able to be like, what you just told me? That's really messed up. Like maybe not that colloquially, but still, it's really, so I do think you can give away a bit of yourself in that way, as long as you're not like, becoming the client in the situation. But in a way, it can be almost a relief for me if I'm going through a difficult day. If I have to take that hat off and put my therapist hat on, it's almost like I get a bit of a break as well, if that makes sense. So if I can kind of, think of it that way, I become this professional in this moment who's helping someone else, and I get a break from my own nonsense.
It's also good because it helps you step out of your own situation and be
Yes.
present for someone else. I think it's good. I love, I've had these conversations around healthy boundaries and
Mhm.
stuff. I think it's interesting as it relates to being part of the LGBT plus community because I feel in some ways there's boundaries and there's not boundaries. And just because of what I've lived with, I'm curious as to your thoughts on that. In some cases, people are very good with boundaries, but I think that in situations where I feel like there's lack of boundaries, there's a very openness. And I think it's important to be open. And so where there aren't boundaries, and I'm not talking about psychologists or
Mhm.
therapists or social worker versus not, I'm talking about humanity in boundary situations. So what I'm asking you from a community, a marginalized community perspective, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that a lack of boundaries can often be linked to open wounds that just haven't healed. And that's like whenever I see or notice someone as a friend, as whatever, in whatever capacity, who clearly just is spilling out and like with no real regard. First of all, it's not only difficult sometimes to make friends and communicate when you're constantly doing that, but also you can accidentally trigger other people as well who've experienced similar concerns. And when I see that, I feel like it's almost a sign of like no one has talked to this person. This person doesn't feel like they have someone to listen to them or understand them. Honestly, I always try to lead with love in this situation because I'm like, this person most likely does not know the effect they're having on other people. But it's very difficult. I think that you did hit on something that can be very difficult for me, especially if you're in a friendly capacity, if it's a social situation. That person is not looking for your critical feedback on their socialization skills. So it's very tough. I usually just, like I said, I try to lead with empathy and understand where they're coming from. But I do believe in protecting yourself as well. If it's going to be something that's going to upset you that someone else says, removing yourself from the situation in a kind and respectful way, I think is perfectly reasonable. But yeah, I think it comes down to people not feeling heard, not feeling like they have their audience, and just desperately seeking that audience, which is why I think community and unconditional positive regard is so important, because I do believe that's a key to a lot of those issues.
But I think it's really interesting, Lucy, when you don't feel seen or heard, that
Mm-hmm.
need to that need to sort of have a blatant disregard for boundaries. And I understand it, by the way. Maybe I was that person 10 years ago. Who the heck knows? But what I will say to you is I get it. And I think it's really interesting. I feel like you have such a beautiful way of articulating these experiences. Clearly, you've happened upon them and understand sort of how to navigate them. As a therapist, do you see similar things, or your job is just to hold space, or has this been something that has been on your consciousness, or it just happens randomly in spaces and you sort of respond to it?
I think that it's different in therapy because you're only getting one person's perspective of their whole life. So oftentimes, everyone is an unreliable narrator. Our memories are, by default, we don't remember things very well. Our brains are bad at our memory, bad at memorization. The more we replay something in our head, the more skewed it gets. That's just facts. Even in the moment, if you're feeling some type of way and someone says something to you, you could interpret it very differently than that person meant it. If I'm talking to someone in a session, I'm not saying I don't believe them. I believe them completely because that's their truth. What they're saying is their truth. But it's a very different scenario than me being like in a social situation and someone rubbing me the wrong way, for example, or oversharing. It's very different in a way.
What are your thoughts on the social media dynamic as it impacts this, all of us, and the people you see and the people you treat?
Especially for the LGBT population, social media can be such a blessing, especially if you're in one of those rural communities I mentioned where you don't really feel like, even not rural, you know what I mean? Even growing up, there weren't a lot of LGBT kids in my school at the time, anyway. So I think that finding friends in other places by using social media can be a legitimate lifesaver. It can save someone's life to have that community. It can save someone's life to have a little friend group, a group chat, these people you've never seen before, but everyone's like, yeah, I understand what you're going through, etc. But on the other hand, social media can be so harmful, and I think is so harmful to the brain. And I'm saying that as someone myself who scrolls social media far too often, struggles with doing things like reading now because of that. Like I used to be such a reader, and now it's so hard for me to read because of that. I think that like anything, it's in moderation and understanding the risks, especially when it comes to things like oversharing, as we're going back to that internet safety, knowing what part of yourself you can put out versus what part of yourself you can't. And that's when having a close parental relationship or close relationship with the caregiver can be so beneficial, because the caregiver can be like, let's just talk about what you're putting on the internet, like not in a judgmental way. And this, if the relationship is good, the youth can feel like they can really share more information. So yeah, I think it's really a blessing and a curse, but I think the curse definitely comes with lack of boundaries and oversharing, and thinking you're best friends with someone, thinking you know someone, but you really don't know them at all. It's one thing to make friends. It's another thing when you're making friends with people also who are way older than you. I mean, that's a lot of grooming, unfortunately, can take place online, for example, or a lot of catfishing, as we all know. We've all seen the TV show. So yeah, I think it's definitely nuanced.
The work you're doing today, like with community isolation, all of that. So how are you sort of approaching, the people you're talking to, the groups, the work you're doing?
I really approach it in regards to community with just not only reaching out in an attempt to understand others, but helping others reach out with that same intent to understand. I think that we're a very individualist country. We really think of ourselves as like these lone heroes going through life. Just being able to have these groups, to train people in a group, to hold therapeutic groups, to work in a group, to work as coworkers. My goal is always to unite us more than divide us. Embrace our differences. So differences are really beautiful. I mean, if we were not different, we'd be very boring. But also to talk about what we can come together on, what we can agree on, how we can resolve conflict. Conflict resolution is something that we're also as a society just woefully not great at. Open communication, etc. So encouraging and fostering open communication as well.
I like that conflict resolution. How do you handle that? Because a lot of people are so uncomfortable with
Mhm.
confrontation, let alone conflict resolution.
Yeah, and I think that's where also open communication can really save the day, because I had a lot of conversations with friends where they'd be like, I don't know, making up names now. Jake is really pissing me off because he keeps leaving his socks in the bathroom, and I actually think I can't live with him anymore. And I'm like, okay, cool. Have you mentioned this at all to Jake? And they'd be like, well, no. And I'm like, well, Jake doesn't know that there's anything wrong with you. And Jake doesn't know this, and Jake thinks we're all hanging out because he isn't aware of what he's doing. And you're getting more and more angry, and you're making up a person really to be angry at in this moment. You're making up that Jake doesn't care about you. Maybe this is how he's all he's ever known in terms of leaving his socks in the bathroom. Maybe he just really doesn't realize. So being able to just say, hey Jake, would you mind like taking your socks out of the bathroom when you're done? I mean, if he says no, then that's another issue. But most of the time, this is your friend. This is someone you care about, someone you live with. Probably will say like, oh yeah, sure. You know what I mean? And I think that that first step of open communication and just being able to say what you're doing is actually getting to me a little. Can we talk about it? A lot of people are very, very uncomfortable with that step, and then they let it just build up and build up until it's like a huge fight. A lot of times I feel like it can just be avoided.
I'm curious, this season's about Women's March for Mental Wellness. How are you marching for mental wellness, Lucy?
For myself, for others, or both.
For both, all of the above.
Self-care is really important for me. And, we always say, my mother might have also said this too, because this is something that we both love so much, is if you're on a plane and the gas and the oxygen mask come down, you put on your own oxygen mask before the person next to you. And that's what it's like being a therapist and just a human being, I believe, as well. If I'm not at my best, if I'm not feeling like I'm taking care of myself, if I'm burnt out, how can I help someone else? So being able to take days off was probably the biggest goal I made for myself this year. I'm really bad at taking days off from my job. We have PTO, we have sick days, and I'm bad at taking them because I'm like, well, it's fine. I can save it for another, I can make it through. And just being able to be like, no, I need the time. I need a day to relax. I need a day to rest. I'm not feeling well. So that's one of the ways I do it for myself, as well as, I put in that I do the Pilates, the acting, the cats, because that is part of what keeps me going, is being able to have those extracurriculars and have that work-life balance. And I advocate doing the same for others. I actually am a supervisor as well. I supervise team members at my job, and I'm advocating for them. I'm like, when it's your lunch break, don't answer me. If I accidentally message you during your lunch break, pretend I don't exist. Like, you shouldn't even be able to see my message. You should have that turned off. You're on vacation. Don't think about me. I don't want you to even think about me a little bit. When my supervisor's on vacation, I'm like, I'm going to miss you because I appreciate having your guidance. Don't worry about that. Like, do your thing. And with clients as well, if need be, if they're saying, well, oh my God, my friend is stressing me out so much because he's putting me through this drama. I'm like, think about yourself also. Like, it's great that you're helping your friend. How is your friend helping you? Who's helping you in this moment? Who's supporting you? So that's like a big aspect of, mental well-being. It's self-care and boundaries.
Interesting conversation with many layers to peel back. But I like how you're handling it and the way you approach it, Lucy. I think it's amazing. I'm curious, is there anything else you'd like to share before we go into closing out and me asking the last question? Because we've covered a lot, but this is your story and this is has been your journey, and you're doing so much in the mental health and wellness space. What else would you like to say to your audience, to our audience?
I think that, I'm still on a journey. It's a little scary, but it's also very exciting to be on that journey and having more to learn. And I think that I never want to get over feeling that way. As a professional, especially, I wish all professionals would see it this way. Is like, no matter how old you are, how much experiences you have, you're always going to learn something new the next day, because you're always going to meet someone who's going to change your perspective or teach you something new. And I think that's really beautiful. It's scary, but I really like it.
I think, just based on what I heard today is probably the sensitivity, the cultural sensitivity, because you've been part of this community that has had these challenges. So you've had to find ways to live, approach, learn, guide, whatever it is you're going to do with your life. This is your platform today to give a message to women and allies from all over the world, all backgrounds, all cultures, all ages. What do you want to leave them with, Lucy?
I think I've kind of spoiled this a little throughout my talk, but we are so much more powerful together than apart. I really so strongly believe in the collective. I so strongly believe in my communities. I so strongly believe in just the collective community, like everyone of all different communities coming together. Differences make us beautiful, and it's important to know and respect and identify these differences, but it's really it can be a divide and conquer thing, and we can't let that happen. You know what I mean? We have to all come together and lead with love and just be able to stand shoulder to shoulder. And I think that we're almost unstoppable when that can happen.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I love unity, the power of unity. And I love the notion of leading with love. Thank you so much, Lucy.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here.
Thanks for listening to Under the Sisterhood. If you haven't already, please give us a quick rating and review on Apple or Spotify. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn so you can hear from more amazing women. This podcast is created and hosted by Under the Sisterhood LLC and Elizabeth Elfenbein, produced by Elizabeth Elfenbein and Matt Butler, and edited by Matt Butler. The music is by Ayla Schaefer. Her song, Rose.